Hi, it's great to be here. I'm Maggie Korst, and I'm in conversation with Abe Greenspoon from the Canadian Federal Public Service, who will be well known to many of you watching this today. We're going to talk about the topic of life in the middle, frozen or creative, helping middle level public servants break out. And I think both Abe and myself have been for long periods of our time middle public servants ourselves. So this is an area that we have a mutual interest in, and something that we think where we think people have a lot more power and capacity to influence their lives from the middle and the destiny of the work of their organisation than sometimes they realise is possible. So before I throw to Abe to talk to us a bit about the work that he's doing and the thoughts that he's got about this topic, I just want to explain the concept of a frozen middle. It is an idea that first came to me from the work of Thinking the Unthinkable, a report that was done, I think, back in 2014 by two English writers, Nick Gowing and Chris Langton. And they were talking about how chief executives from public and private sectors were struggling, didn't think that they were prepared to be able to cope with the level of change that they were facing. And one of the reasons why they thought that they were challenged was that effectively that they'd created organisations, or that they were leading organisations where a whole lot of the talent was effectively trapped. People were reluctant to exercise initiative. There was a lot of risk-averse behaviour. And that meant that when big issues came forth, or where they wanted people to do work on various things, they couldn't find people to throw this work to because the culture wasn't really up for working on complexity and big ideas. So, however, the other side to this is that the work of an academic from this Canadian academic, Sanford Borens, who worked at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, did a very interesting work over about 10 years where he studied where innovations came from in government organisations. And he discovered that most of the innovations were generated by people in the middle of organisations, and that they were much more likely to succeed than innovations initiated top down, and that effectively people at the middle were very much motivated by finding problems they were interested in and then doing something about those problems. So he said, all you really need to do is to match a person to a problem they're interested in, and they will be, therefore, after that, take initiative. So there's two sort of concepts here. One is that we've got a middle level of public sector organisations resist change. Other side is that actually they're desperately trying to make changes, and what they need is a little bit of interest, or I guess effectively people not stopping them from taking initiative and exercising change. I hope that's some reasonable description of the concept of the middle, innovative middle, or the frozen middle. So I want to start by asking you, Abe, what do you think about that? Do you think that we do suffer from a frozen middle in your experience in working in government?
Thanks, Margie. I really like the question. Thanks for having me here today. It's really nice to join you. And yes, I mean, I've certainly heard many stories from people inside the public service here in Canada, where people are finding real challenges trying to affect change because of rules or culture or permissions. Absolutely. But it's interesting. I don't necessarily think that the two pieces of work that you're mentioning are necessarily, in contradiction or are necessarily paradoxical, because I think it can simultaneously be true that, most innovation is initiated by people at the front or the middle of organizations, but also that those people are actually the most likely to face resistance and face the greatest number of obstacles in organizations. So I think what's interesting about this this question is like, where does it actually come from? What are some of the root causes of the symptoms that we're seeing that we might describe as the frozen middle? And what I think about in organizations is I tend to think about things like the design of the organization, or the distribution of power inside of the organization, or what people usually call culture in organizations, relationships, norms, patterns of behavior, and then the relationship between those different factors and how those kind of all work together in complex ways. So, in government, for example, we have very hierarchical organizations, and so in those types of organizations, power flows from the top down. And there's lots of reasons why the public service is set up in a hierarchical kind of way that traditionally have worked really well for the public service and delivered a lot of really great results. But with decision making happening at the top, with power and authority residing at the top and flowing downward, most decisions get made at the top. Far fewer decisions get made at the bottom of organizations. There's much less autonomy at the bottom of the organizations. And so when there are issues that we're trying to solve, that need our attention, that need to, have the benefit of people interested in affecting change from the organizations, from within the organizations, a lot of these factors will come into play. And what you would like to see more of, just thinking further about, if we accept that some of these challenges do exist, what would we like to see a little bit different if we wanted to see change? A different approach might be that more decision making happens at the lower to bottom levels of the organization, and even within the middle levels of the organization, obviously, where people with local context, local contextual knowledge can solve some of those big complex problems that we see organizations facing. So when you talk about CEOs, looking at their organization and not seeing that people are ready, that might be the case, and that might be some of it. What might also be is there might be circumstances that are preventing people from acting in those circumstances, that these structures, these systems, this distribution of power, the way we think about an organization, right? The paradigm that we have about organizations being hierarchical and about, vertical decision-making, some of those design elements, some of those structures of the organization are a lot of the things that I see inhibiting people. So I think it's really important that we also really focus not just on the individuals, their behaviors, and that being the limitation. We need to look at the root cause. What is influencing the behavior of these people inside the organization? What are the systemic elements that are actually preventing people from being innovative, being change agents, disruptive, affecting change, and influencing their organizations?
It's interesting that you're talking about the power dynamics within organizations and hierarchical structures, which everybody, I guess, well, most people would agree, put a dampener on what people feel like they're allowed to do, or where they've got authority to do things. And one of the things that I was thinking about the other day was, as you progress through an organization, particularly once you start to get into a management level, you get invited to sit in on conversations that you don't get invited to when you're not in a management level job. And so what that means is you start to actually know what is being discussed, as opposed to it being filtered to you through other people. And that feels to me like it's a big issue within organizations, because if you're getting very filtered information, you may well be getting the wrong idea about what people really are thinking, or what really the ambition is of the leadership within the organization. It's quite a false way that we communicate, isn't there, within organizations? It's sort of all a little bit performance-like, a bit theatrical, a bit unauthentic, is that the word? Inauthentic. So, in a sense, you're a bit behind the what's the term? You're a bit behind it to start with, because you're not really understanding what the conversations are, and you're not being invited to participate in them.
Yeah, and I mean the old sort of cliche saying of knowledge is power, right?
Mm.
Knowing the context and having the information that you need to do your job is, is what creates different power dynamics. And definitely that's a feature of a hierarchical system where, knowledge rests in the hands of the people who are, essentially tasked with the accountability or the responsibility for doing the work, and then they have the most knowledge, and they choose, they sort of broker or they gatekeep that knowledge for the people below them by virtue of the way that information is disseminated in the system. So we definitely see that for sure. And then if organizations are looking to be more adaptive, they're looking to be more oriented towards solving complex problems, they need to figure out better ways to distribute that information in transparent ways where people can access it really easily. I mean, there's a tangible way that you can either enable or disable a better distribution of power in the organization so that people can affect change in the middle and at lower levels.
I think there's also a case as well, though, that people can claim power, and people do claim their own power within an organization. I mean, sometimes it's because they've got a manager who is encouraging and essentially absorbs the risk. Like, I think it's quite interesting how Audrey Tang in Taiwan talks about this idea of you need somebody who's prepared to absorb the risk, and then people feel free to go off and do different things, take more risky, do more risky things, because they know that they're not going to be blamed or held to account in most instances, I would think. But we don't have that very often. Sometimes people do it quite informally. It's not a formal role, but sometimes people informally do a very good job of putting creating a bit of a space around a person and saying, yeah, go off and do that and find that out and pursue something you're interested in, because I'm interested in it too. Sometimes it's the manager feels like they've got less leeway to do what they want to do, but the person that works with them can. So they sort of create a bit of a safe space for them.
Yeah, I've had the good fortune of lots of great leaders in my career who've created really great space for me to be creative. The challenge I've seen that creates in organizations is those people move around, they come and they go, they leave and they get replaced by other people. So organizations that are looking to sustain a sort of culture of innovation or are looking for something that's a little bit bigger, longer term, that can affect the whole organization, it's a little bit hard to rely on individual leaders. And there are a lot of really great individual leaders who do that practice of creating space. But if that practice of creating space or the availability of that space is not equally distributed and it's not built into the system as a feature of the organization, then it relies on people who come and go. I've seen a lot of that lead to unsustainable circumstances. We try to push forward innovation projects and then someone leaves, or they move and they take their project with them and it goes somewhere else, and then the organization's left without it. So it's nice to have those leaders who create that space, and at the same time we also need to think a little bit more sustainably about what the long term looks like for the organization and how do we mainstream that into the organization.
I agree with you about the issue of people moving around and how that disrupts good things happening. And I think there's always a mismatch between how long it takes for an idea to go through stages of development and get and almost be able to prove itself. There's a mismatch between how long that takes and how much attention an organization or a manager is able to give to an idea. And as you say, one of the issues for a lack of attention span is that they go and get another job and that window of time is now closed, and the new person who comes in wants to create their own thing. They don't want to build on the legacy of someone that's come before. And so I'm always incredibly shocked by the amount of energy and time and money that goes into projects and programs that it ends up being completely wasted almost because of an individual's inclination. I guess this is the dark side of individualism within public sector organizations. Like there's the light side, which is these people who are able to do amazing things within organizations. And then there's the dark side of these people that come in who say, well, it's about me and I want my stuff to be the top priority, and everything that has come before, I'm not interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this, going back to the free agent program. One of the questions that I've got, because free agent program that you were instrumental in designing and developing in Canada is a very powerful, I think, idea, which is that you join, you essentially find a way for somebody to express something that they're interested in, their own curiosity within their work. You match the person to the project rather than, well, maybe it's the same as the project to the person, but essentially you're essentially matchmaking between people and what they're interested in and work that needs to be done. I'm wondering what you think about this idea of people. Can we sustain within these organizations a sense of everybody following their own curiosity? Where would that go? Can that scale up?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I want to just, before I answer that, to just say, you talked a little bit about leadership, and like we were talking about how the movement of people can affect a program like this. And one of the interesting things about our program was that we were able to sort of maintain some consistent leadership, and that when we built the program, we designed it specifically in a way so that it was really difficult to dismantle in an organization. And I could get into the details about what that is, but we don't really have time for that. But suffice it to say, a feature that I often advocate for people to think about is to think about what is the feature that is going to sustain a program or a project through leadership change, or through the type of change that could potentially disrupt it. And we intentionally built it with that question in mind, asking, how can we design this program so that it sustains leadership changes over time? And I will say on record that many of the leaders who have joined this program, I believe, have in one way or another wanted to figure out ways to dismantle it and to undo some of the work that we had done. And we made it intentionally very difficult for them to do so. We called it the poison pill approach. Anyway, it's not such a big secret. I've written about it in the past a little bit, but it's an interesting note for thinking about programs. But your question about, whether or not this sort of mobility or autonomy in career decision-making is a big one for the program, as we were thinking about building it, was whether or not everyone in the public service, we have about 275,000 or so people in our public service, could potentially be a free agent. Could we have a workforce of just free agents, for example? I think the simple answer today is no. We couldn't. We couldn't have only free agency. There are some jobs that you can't. You can't have that level of like variability and movement and unpredictability. There's a lot of the work that we do that needs predictability and sustainability, and so that's one part of it. The other part of it is not everybody wants to be a free agent. So not everybody wants that high degree of mobility and autonomy. I think autonomy is a good thing for everybody. Not everybody actually wants that level of mobility where people are moving around regularly. When we looked at it in our public service, we sort of noted that you'd need a different employment contract with people whereby they would be sort of accepted in the system as permanent free agents. And our public service has done things like this in the past. We've had internal consulting kind of placement programs in the past in our public service where you could hire consultants from within the organization. Free agents isn't exactly like internal consultants. It's a model that the consultancy model, I think, is a familiar one to people. So we're often compared to that. But the idea of having this at a really large scale, I think you would need some sort of permanence for the program where you'd have a separate employment agreement. And it gets into the HR stuff, and it's not really worth going into in too much depth. But I think the short answer is no. It isn't for everybody. It shouldn't be scaled at such a rate or to such an extent that it is, a large portion of the public service. It's just a really valuable way for people to think about their career, where they're the ones that get to decide what they're passionate about. And you talked about that in your introduction, just the idea of being able to put people onto projects that they're passionate about, that align with their values, where they're able to think through, what do I want out of my career? What do I want out of my job? What are the things that I want to do? How do I want to work? Where do I want to work? To be able to answer those questions and then, have a mechanism by which you can freely move within the system to figure out the right place for you at the specific time. I think there's no question that we saw some real benefits. And if you talk to anyone who's in the program or the managers who hired free agents, I think you'd hear pretty unanimously that you get really good results from that type of formula.
I think that I'm very interested in, when we talk about government organizations, we often talk about cultures, and it always feels like quite an intangible concept. Everybody's always trying to change the culture, but the culture essentially is quite resistant to change. Even if people change, the culture somehow seems to be its own thing. But I personally have always thought that, well, if we get a critical mass of people that are being brave and taking initiative and testing ideas and being curious, that somehow it is possible to change an organization culture, even if, this is a question I'm not completely convinced by myself, but even if the leadership is resistant, if there's enough of people within the organization that operate in a different way, because often you see people who are very engaged in their work and interested, and something about them has a spillover effect to the people that work around them. They start to kind of be encouraging to other people, even if they're not doing it deliberately. They provide a model for people to say, oh, it's possible to be like that within this organization. So essentially, but I'm wondering whether you think, is it possible to transform an organization from the middle?
Yeah, the person I like to point to for this, the work I like to point to is Donella Meadows, who is a sort of systems thinker that a lot of people are familiar with. And she writes about leverage points in systems. It's sort of one of her, I think, probably most famous, most referenced pieces of work. And she talks about paradigms in organizations and how you change the paradigm of an organization. And interestingly, from her perspective, and I like it, that she talks about how paradigms can actually change. The paradigm she has as her second, I think, most, powerful point of leverage in an organization in changing a system. And she says that paradigms in organizations or in systems can actually change quite quickly. And the way that they change is through repetition, through loud voices, through voices advocating loudly for the thing that they're looking for, and for that, in a way, and I'm paraphrasing it, sort of growing as a movement where people are, continually advocating and pushing for the change that they want to see. And it reaches this sort of crescendo, and then it can just flip in an instant. It takes a lot of work. It takes incredible amount of dedication. You don't see it happen often because of the amount of energy and sheer will that it takes, but that it happens, and it can happen very quickly when you see sort of, cultural revolutions happening in society. Organizations, I think, from her perspective, can change in that kind of way. So I'm optimistic about that. I'm optimistic about that idea that individuals inside of organizations, absent leadership that even wants that sort of change to take place, because generally leadership does not want that sort of change to take place, that you can see paradigms shift because of the will of people inside of organizations. I don't have any great examples of it in our context. I don't know that I've seen it happen in the public service, but I think that's an interesting concept. And I think we should think about that as we're thinking about the changing cultures that we see in organizations. I mean, I've been in the public service for 12 years, and I hear people speaking really loudly since I've been joining here about the need for more innovation, more experimentation, the need for a change in culture, the need for us to think about organizations really differently. And I anecdotally for sure, but I see change happening all across the organizations where I work. It's not happening quickly enough, and it's not happening to a great enough extent, but it is happening, and it is being influenced by loud voices, by commitment from people with a lot of energy to do the work. So I think it's definitely possible.
Do you think it's a generational thing, or do you think it's like a moment thing, like a zeitgeist thing, that people have different expectations of what they want their lives to be and their working lives to be?
Well, I think there's a lot of things happening. I think that could definitely be part of it. But I think this change has been happening for a long time. I think technology, technology for sure has done a lot to change the way that we think about our work. We don't have the same number of organizations where people are working in sort of traditional factory kinds of settings. In the public service, since that's the context we're talking about, there's still like relatively few people who work in like operational heavy circumstances, and even in those circumstances, there's lots of ideas about how that work is changing and shifting over time. So we don't really work in that type of context anymore, and so it's a really different expectation that comes with those kinds of jobs. If you're not being counted in terms of the number of widgets you create, but you're actually being assessed based on knowledge type of work, where you create things, where you assess things, where you give advice and you influence in that kind of way, the way that you do that, your expectations will change for how work is conducted inside of organizations. And I think that's what we're seeing a shift in the type of work that's being done. And so people have really different expectations about how they're managed, about what opportunities they have, about how they participate inside the organization, about what power that they're given, what authority they're given. They have really different expectations about how they exist as employees inside of organizations. I think it's a shift that's been coming for a long time, and it's really important, I think, that we figure out how to make that transition from this old mechanical kind of operational perspective to what I see as the future of work, which is much more knowledge-based, and it's much more innovative and experimental in the way that people participate.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think firstly, I really like your idea that things can change quickly. We think that things always take time, and we might find that things change very quickly, but also we're in where we're dealing with a very highly educated group of people. You will inevitably, they're doing work that is complex and complicated. Inevitably, the organization isn't going to be able to contain them if it's rigid and hierarchical and closed-minded. It's going to have to break open. It's going to inevitably, it feels to me like it will inevitably break open.
Okay.
These cultures, they try to hang on. They do try to hang on. I think we both have a lot of faith in what people are able to do, given the circumstances that they're put into. So look, thank you so much, Abe. I appreciate the conversation. I think it's the beginning of something. We've got a long way to go, but I think we are seeing change, as you're saying. The things that you've been doing make a big difference to that. You're a part of a global conversation, and I think all the pieces are coming together in a very interesting way. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and for the way that you're open and sharing about that work, because I think that's quite an act of generosity for the world that we need from public servants at the moment. So thank you
Absolutely.
so much for joining us at the festival.
My pleasure. Thanks, Margie.
Thank you.